Hey, this is Arthur Protazio from Fableware Narrative Design, and you are listening to We Are One, You Are Two PlayStation Podcast.
All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another episode of We Are One, You Are Two, a PlayStation and video game podcast. I am your host, as always, Rob Fanzo, joined once again this week by Matt Rhodes.
Heyo.
Matt, last week we talked with Arthur a little bit and his game Sword Legacy Omen from Fableware Narrative Games.
We did.
Guess what? We got part 2 for you this week, so
What?
we're going to go ahead and talk. Yeah, I know.
Part 2?
Part 2. So if you missed part 1, you better go back and listen to the first, 45, 50 minutes of it. And we've got another 30 to 40 here for you as well today.
Heck yeah.
So we're excited. We're going to enjoy it, and we're going to sit back and relax while Arthur continues talking to us about, Fableware Narrative Design and the game.
Sweet.
So I was actually hoping, and you'd mentioned this briefly before, probably a few minutes ago, but I'll kind of jump back to that. You had mentioned about people asking about being very Brazilian, or people being, is this game somehow connected, and you wanted to be more of a global audience. But I have noticed recently, and maybe this is just my Twitter feed because I live in an echo chamber with it, but I have noticed a larger group of developers coming out of Brazil. And I was wondering what you thought has contributed to that recent kind of slew of games and development that's kind of been pushed internationally, probably even more so, I think, in the last, year or so.
Well, I think there are a series of factors that directly affect the growth of the Brazilian industry. And I do think this is such an interesting topic because I'm really happy to see the Brazilian industry flourish. It doesn't mean that we are not facing, of course, different struggles and difficulties, etc. But on the other hand, it does mean that if you take a look at past decades, so here specifically in Brazil, I'm pretty much very active in the indie dev scene, and not specifically only as Fableware Narrative Design by providing narrative services and working on different indie games, but also from a community-wise perspective. When we talked about my work initially as an academic researching games. And that was when I was actually able to also represent the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, here in Rio. So I used to run the Rio de Janeiro chapter for the IGDA. And that was a very interesting phase of I can't speak for the whole of Brazil, but at least here in Rio, it was a very interesting phase of the industry because we had people who were interested in game development, but you had programmers who didn't know designers existed. You had designers who didn't know artists existed. You had artists who didn't know writers existed. So the meetups that I organized, they were really important to make people get to know each other. And that was, I'd say that probably the first process of being able to understand that, hey, you have people who are interested in creating and developing games. You just got to put these people together, and then teams will naturally form. And through these teams, you're going to have different projects emerging. So that happened, and then I can't tell exactly when, but I'd say around perhaps 2008, 9, 2010. If you advance a few years, you're going to notice that people are more qualified in developing games. Not only are they more qualified, but the game development tools have also been made more accessible. So now people have access to Unity. People have access to Unreal. Mm-hmm. People are starting to use more frequently GameMaker or etc. Unity is probably by far the most used engine here in Brazil for game development. There are people, of course, who use Unreal, but I'd say that Unity is like super common here and people use it a lot. Sword Legacy was developed in Unity. And what's interesting is that, so people have access to game development tools. People are starting to get to know each other. that's when you start having interesting projects coming up. You start to have more game jams, either remote or actually on-site game jams. And so the scene started to heat up and people start to get engaged, people start to get involved, and then they enjoy this process of developing games and meeting new people. Let's advance a couple more years, and then you get to a point, which is kind of like the point we're at, which is people already know how to make games, but they're going through the hurdle of starting their own studios or companies. And that's when the business factor comes in. And right now, we have a series of studios that are present and exist and produce games and put out games here in Brazil, but it's still really hard to attain that sustainability. I mean, starting a studio might be just as hard as maintaining it, as keeping it afloat, even financially wise, especially financially wise. What's interesting is now that we're probably at this point where a lot of new studios are popping up, the other ones that already exist for some time are just trying to be sustainable. And more opportunities, even institutionally speaking, are emerging. So the National Film Agency here in Brazil, in late 2016, that's when they officially started for the first time putting out investment opportunities for a game project. So you could present your project, and depending on how much money you ask, depending on your budget, you could get up to 1 million reais, which I'd say would translate to roughly $250,000 US. So wow. You would be able to get up to $250,000 to be able to develop your game. Of course, that means that if you do get that money, then as an investment, the film agency would have a percentage over that. And they would, of course, keep an eye and see, hey, will you release that game in a year or 2 years? So that's something that's currently happening. But it did create, and that's fantastic, it did create opportunities for new studios or for professionals who even had worked in the industry for quite some time, but didn't have the budget opportunity. I do think that a lot of elements come into play and affect the Brazilian game industry and, of course, the quality of the games that have come out. I mean, there are a series of games, not only Sword Legacy, of course, Sword Legacy is one of them, but a series of games that have won different awards, going all the way from, so we won most recently a Best Game Award at the Lisboa Games Week in Portugal. But we have games who have also been nominated for the IGF, have won at different festivals throughout the whole world. And we have a very interesting festival that takes place in São Paulo here in Brazil, which is called Big as well. And it's an international film festival. I mean, for the narrative category last year, who won was Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. So we do have international games participating. And I do think also that this connection with the international industry and market makes a huge difference because it motivates Brazilian developers to up their ante and create even cooler games or well-produced or well-made. You know, it's a healthy competition, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just curious your take on that because, like I said, I've certainly seen several developers coming out of Brazil recently. Just on my Twitter feed that people have talked about another Brazilian developed game, or another one just developed by a team out of Brazil, and it really seems to be there seems to be a lot more indies and names coming out of that, and so that's only going to get better and stronger because that certainly encourages other people to continue to drive that way as well.
Yeah, definitely. And what I think is really, really, really cool about Brazilian games or indie games, or even when you have a game that so we have specific companies here in Brazil, for example, that I wouldn't say they're AAA, but they're the closest we have to AAA, and are definitely not your typical indie games. You look at them and you notice like, hey, so this is It might even look like a AAA game. You do know that from a production value standpoint, it's not your typical indie game budget. What's really interesting is that what I do think that really represents well the Brazilian games is that regardless of the budget available, we're always trying to create something unique. So like I said with Sword Legacy, we do have several international references, but they're also part of our culture, and that's how we process all of that and bring forth a tale that is based on what we're good at doing. So we do have, for example, we have we have this fairy creature in the game. The nickname is Flint, but the actual name, like the proper name for that character, is Curupfala. And Curupfala is actually just a play on words that I did, mixing with this creature called the Curupira, which is typical of the Brazilian folklore. It's kind of like this Brazilian monster that is part of the myths and legends of the original nations here from Brazil, like the people who lived here before the Portuguese or the Europeans arrived here in South America. So it's really interesting to see. What we like to do is bring forth this culture along with the game, but it's not necessarily the same as you're not necessarily playing a Brazilian folklore game. You're playing a Brazilian game because it's this process of mixing and matching a series of different elements that are very pertinent to the Brazilian culture, even if they aren't originally from the Brazilian culture.
Interesting. Yeah, so the game was featured as part of the Indie Gamer Chicks Indie Select. So tell us kind of how that came about and what kind of additional impact that may have resulted from the exposure.
So that was, again, for us, very, very cool. So we were wanting to participate in that process as well, because we wanted to be able to, we know that having access to games is not something easy. Of course, nowadays you do see a lot of games that are cheaper, and you have a variety of prices, especially for games on PC. But we wanted to be able to be part of a process in which not only, of course, we could have more people play Sword Legacy, but also be able to play it even if, depending on the circumstances, you're not able to get access to it for either financial or distribution reasons. And the exposure that we got was really cool. Well, I mean, I'd say that firsthand because we're here talking with you guys.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. And I do think there is a very important element, which is being an indie developer means you're always going to have to struggle with visibility. Being able to put your product, your project out there is extremely tough. We spent roughly 4 years developing Sword Legacy. I mean, about 3 years and a half, something like that. But it was quite some time. And it's really sad when you spend so much time dedicating your energy to a specific project, and when it's done, when it's published, you don't see. I mean, of course, you're going to always wish for as many people as possible that are to play your game. But I mean, there's a point in which you can think, hey, we really think that the game could reach a stronger audience, or at least reach an audience that we do realize is more connected to the tactical or RPG scene. So this is something that we really felt was super cool about this whole process, because we managed to reach a wider audience, but also in a way an audience that was genuinely interested in the game. I mean, it's whenever you release a game, you're always going to aim for a series of media outlets, etc. And of course, you're hoping to get the best reviews, and the best reviews from all the way to the super websites to the smaller ones as well. But I do think that it's amazing when someone approaches you and says, hey, I really like your game. I want to review it for my YouTube channel or for my website or for my podcast or whatever. And then you're like, amazing. Yeah, let's do this. Because you don't see when you least expect, from where you least expect people who are interested and represent your core audience reach out to you and express their interest in the game. So that was, I mean, I'd say that was the sum of the process for us. It was really cool to be able to get this extra exposure and especially be here right now talking about the game to you guys.
Yeah, cool. I would agree with that. And I think that your traditional websites, you know, your IGNs and some of your bigger ones, I think they're slowly kind of falling to the wayside. I think that there's a lot more trust or a lot more being put on, like you mentioned, the developers and the smaller or creators, I should say, and influencers that have YouTube channels or will stream your game, who are genuinely fans of that genre. Because I do think people are looking for somebody that understands or agrees with their gaming habits, and those influencers have a much better opportunity to do that. And so I know, like Indie Gamer Chick, I love watching her tweet out and post stuff and get these indie selects, or you know, she did the indie Christmas one together because she really has a community that she has built of people who understand the importance or who really look for indie games to play. And so you tend to benefit, I think, from those as a developer, being able to reach out to those audiences and speak. And I know we really enjoyed talking to you guys, and so that has been a really benefit for us as well as for you, in that you get an exposure to a different audience or to an audience that has that kind of taste. And if that means 10 or 100 or, you know, 400 more people check out your game, it's certainly worth it in the end.
And I do think, Rob, that I just thought of 3 keywords that I think are really important in this process. One of them, so what actually kickstarted the process was, you mentioned the word community. And one thing that I did not mention before was that when I was working in the academia, I wrote a lot of articles about game design or narrative design in general. And I noticed that when you write, of course, an academic article, you're going to have people from the academia read it. But I really wanted to broaden the access to that knowledge. So I actually started in 2011 a YouTube channel. It was a YouTube channel in Portuguese focused on discussing storytelling for games. And one of the first things that I did, this was actually the first video ever, I actually talked about the concepts of emergent and embedded narrative, which are academic concepts from academic books discussing game design. Making things simpler, it just means that the embedded narrative is the actual script for a game. So it's what the developer or the creator defines as content. So that those are the actual lines of the characters. So in Super Mario, you always know that Mario is probably going to have to save Peach because Bowser kidnapped her. But the emergent narrative is when you're actually playing the game, you failed because you lost all of your lives, or you actually jumped on top of a Koopa Trooper and then the shell actually hit the wall and then hit you back and you lost. So this story that shapes itself based on players' interactions and decisions is actually the emergent narrative. So I started the channel talking about this concept, and this concept is like paramount for what I do as Fableware. I mean, interestingly enough, that's why the academic research was so important, even in my master's, to my work as a professional, as a writer, because I do bring this academic knowledge to the practice that I do when writing scripts, when creating storyboards, etc. And what I do find interesting is that when I created the channel, it was never this huge channel, but it has a very strong community. It had a select group and slowly, I mean, every now and then it slowly expanded, but the focus was on something that I could say proudly was I had never had any sort of trouble with trolls on the internet because it was a small community, you know? It was just about the people who were interested in discussing a narrative design or storytelling in games. And it was awesome. It was fantastic. I mean, unfortunately, the channel is dormant right now. And I do think of at some point taking it back, probably even in English. But I did notice it made me realize that community is like absolutely valuable. You guys, with the work that you do, I bet you have people that are really connected and ask about either a new topic or something in the next episode, or people who just comment And there's this, again, and we talked about this in the beginning of the podcast, but that's when we start to see the human factor play in. And the human factor makes this huge difference when you're trying to put your game out there, when you're trying to create a connection with people. So you've got community, and then you've got the idea that being indie is not just creating a budget game. I mean, I've seen people, these are reviews on Steam, people saying, hey, I see Sword Legacy being compared to a lot of huge games out there. And I do know it's a budget game. I mean, it is smaller, et cetera, but it is a fantastic game nonetheless. And then people start explaining different reasons for why Sword Legacy is awesome. And I mean, when I read that review, I'm like, yeah, all right. I mean, this is fantastic. It really represents us, because we know we're budget. Come on. The game was self-funded. We were like, it took a lot of time and energy and our funds as well to put this game together. We do realize we don't have the budget for creating anything close to a AAA game, but we're really proud of what we managed to do. We didn't do a crowdfunding campaign. We just managed to get together what we could, the team that we were able to, and it was a fantastic team, and we made the game possible. When you see this human factor play in, people realize that being indie is not just about creating a smaller project, but also that being indie comes in the form of doing reviews or analyzing content. It's also about being closer to the community. So as game devs, we need to be in touch with our community who likes to play Sword Legacy, but we also need to be in touch with reviewers who approach us directly and say, hey, I like your game, or I like the genre of which your game is a part of, and I'd like to try it out. And that's super awesome because it just shows that we also realize that you're not this huge website. You're not this huge gaming outlet that goes every year to E3. We do realize that you have a very smaller budget. And that's awesome because we're on the same level. You analyze content, you review content, we create content. And why aren't we helping each other out, So it's this back and forth of the community of also being indie and, of course, having the human factor play in, realizing that we're all, of course, individuals trying to survive in this world. But it does mean that we can help each other a lot in this process and in a healthy way, in a way that it's a win-win situation. You see, it's not about one taking something from the other. It's actually just sharing and everyone can be happy at the end,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and it's so important. And I think you touched on one of the questions that was going to ask you later on, but it really does touch into paying particular attention to the current gaming landscape or paying attention to that community that you build around that landscape, because then it helps you also shape, kind of the direction that you want to go from game to game, or shape the direction of, what kind of mechanics you employ or what type of narrative you might pursue, because those people are ultimately the ones that are, and I hate to use the term brand loyalty, but are the ones that are thirsty or desiring to, see you develop something new or to go in a direction. And they're the ones that will support you and help drive that relationship that ultimately helps provide them with content and then allow them to create content but also allow them to enjoy the content as well that you're both creating. So.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're super grateful for the opportunity. You guys asked about the process of the exposure with Gamer Chick, etc. And I mean, we're super grateful for that because you mentioned brand loyalty. And I mean, I think brand in this specific expression, it's just a way of saying you could replace brand for name or for symbol. It's just people looking at a specific symbol and at the end of the day, being empathetic about it. It's more about, in a way, empathy, loyalty. It's like being loyal to something in which you relate to, and that you also understand you're being taken seriously. You're not just another grain of salt in the beach. You're actually someone that matters, that is heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
Quick comment. I do know that I talk a lot. So if you guys do need me to shorten my responses, let me know. No problem.
No, honestly, we like people who can thoroughly explain themselves. Because, I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's better to listen to. And you're talking about, like, the developer aspects of things and, like, what you're excited about. I mean, you being passionate about these these answers is not a bad thing in any way.
Yeah, I think that certainly reflects it, and it goes back to the community thing, right? You hear your developer being passionate about their projects and the role that they play in that. I think it certainly reflects in their products, and I think it, that kind of gets the community excited about too. And I think that's sometimes lost if people don't, if you don't have people who are the face of a company or the face of a project. It can be easy to forget that so much passion goes behind creating the creation process.
No, definitely. So I personally think that reading reviews about your work is like therapy, because it's just, you go through a process of at the same time feeling happy about something you created, but at the same time it's like, hey, be humble, man, because if you think you're on the top of your game, or if you think you're in the top of the world, think again. It's like you're always going to see different comments praising or berating or criticizing and sometimes in a healthy, sometimes in an unhealthy manner, the work that you've done.
Yeah.
But on Steam, for example, my Steam profile is categorized as a developer for Sword Legacy. So whenever I comment on the forums of For Sword Legacy in Steam, it identifies me as a developer. And of course, I mean, this is also part of the Steam guidelines. They usually tell you not to interfere too much in the forums, because they say that it's better for the players to talk about the game with each other, and they might feel not too comfortable if a developer is over there all the time interfering. So I try to keep a healthy, safe distance. But I did notice at some point, for example, specific comments, either reviews or just general discussions in the forums. And what I really wanted to do, so you mentioned this getting in touch, the brand loyalty thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that I did do was read specific comments either in the forums or as reviews, and send direct messages to these players saying, hey, I noticed that you disliked something about the game, or that you liked something about the game, and I really liked reading your opinion. If it's no trouble and if you're comfortable with that, would you mind explaining that further? So I've read amazing feedback from players who were willing to spend a little more time further developing their opinions and impressions of the game. And I mean, from a design perspective, as a creator, as a developer, as a content producer, that was fantastic. And that would never have been possible if we were not talking specifically about this community element and being able to have a more one-on-one discussion based on the content you're putting out. If we were just always interacting with each other on a very high level aspect, meaning just big websites with big reviews and masses commenting on a massive scale, when you're able to go to this one-on-one level, it's amazing. Seriously, it's amazing. And again, it's not just because you're reading a bad review. I mean, a review that scores your game negatively, that necessarily that reviewer is someone aggressive or hostile. It just means that, and it's fantastic. I've heard amazing opinions, both positive and negative regarding the game, but always positive as a learning experience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you're involved in developing, but do you play games? And if so, what kind of games are you into?
Awesome. Okay, so first and foremost, this is my personal opinion, but it would be absurd if I were into developing games and I did not enjoy playing them. And I'm that's
usually the general consensus when we talk to developers, but yeah.
But the word usual scares me, and I'm serious, because it's like, so the thing is, just a quick analogy. People know me as a writer, of course, for, again, different mediums. But a lot of people do know me, especially because I write for games. And in a way, this is something more uncommon than writing for TV or film, etc. And a lot of writers approach me and say, hey, I want to get into writing games too. It sounds awesome. And I'm like, yeah, it is awesome. But do you play games? And they're like, not really. I'm like, come on, seriously? So what? and then I asked them, so let's just think of this for a second. You've watched an amazing movie, and then you realize the director hates movies. And then you've just watched an amazing play, and you realize that a director hates the theater. So what? Can you fathom that possibility? Does it even make sense to you? If you want to be familiar with the medium, you got to be part of it. You got to live it. I mean, it's just, I'm just venting here, but it's just that, come on. What? Seriously? Anyway. Okay. So moving on. I'm really, 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 and this is quite obvious, self-explanatory, but I'm really into narrative-driven games. I play all the way from text adventures to I'm really sorry that Telltale is no more a company.
Yes.
Yeah.
What else? I mean, I before Netflix put out Bandersnatch, I played Late Shift on Steam, and then before that, I played the interactive adventures on the Sega CD. I'm really, really, really into. So what I'm not, it's easier to say what I'm not, which is, and that's also part of the reason why I don't consider myself a game designer per se. I am able to design games. Of course, I do design games, and I do possess the skill of game design, but I always use game design for a narrative, because if you have me play, example, Candy Crush for, I don't know, just put it in my hand, it's not going to last 5 minutes. I'm going to get bored. I'm going to get bored very quickly, because
There's a loose narrative there.
I mean, there's certainly an emergent narrative.
Of course.
I mean, you're going to play Tetris, and you can go through some very exciting emergent narratives, some very exciting tales of almost forming a line and then putting your piece in the wrong place, and then that's the end of it. But I mean, so of course, player emergent stories are always possible, but the thing is, if the game is purely mechanical, for me, at some point it starts to lose its appeal, because I do miss a more a storytelling aspect, sometimes connected to characters or sometimes connected to a social critique of sorts. I mean, there's an interesting example. So when I started pursuing game development, I do highly recommend for anyone who wants to even remotely work with games, I think it's a must for you to attend game jams. And I did attend one game jam a lot of years ago, in which I developed an experimental game, and we did not have an artist on our team, and that's very evident by the graphics. And it is a game that looks like an Atari game, kind of like Pong, but it is a 2-player local multiplayer game in which you have a fugitive and you have a pursuer, or someone who's always chasing the fugitive. The catch of the game is that you're always playing in the same maze. So one character starts on the left end of the maze and the other character starts on the right end. The thing is, when you press spacebar, that's when officially the game begins. Everything goes like pitch black. And the fugitive needs to find a specific trapdoor so you've got 4 trapdoors, one for each corner of the maze, but only one of them will randomly open. And the pursuer needs to find the fugitive before the fugitive gets to one of these, to the unlocked trapdoor. The catch is, since it's a local multiplayer game, whenever one of these characters uses a light source and the fugitive uses kind of like a radio light source, looks kind of like if the character had lit up a match. And the pursuer uses a cone-like light source, which would be akin to a flashlight.
Okay.
You have this idea that one character probably using a flashlight and another probably using matches. One is trying to catch the other, and the other is trying to escape. But the thing is, despite always playing the same maze, I created this and that is a loose narrative, but a loose narrative that you always have these 2 characters in the same mansion in France throughout different years of history. And one of the most amazing experiences in my life as a game dev that I've ever witnessed and lived is that the game was being exhibited at this museum in São Paulo, and I saw two players just having fun with the game. So at some point they reach a level which is actually it says when you begin the level, it says something Belle Epoque Mansion, Paris, France. I don't even remember if it's Paris, probably 1942. And then that gives you a hint of the context. But then players started playing and going through the levels. And then at one point, the pursuer manages to catch the fugitive. And then that's when on screen a dialogue comes up. And then the pursuer says, got you. Now it's time to go back to Auschwitz. And then the player was like, oh man, what did I do? I was a Nazi? So that was, and then I saw the two, and then they stopped playing and they started discussing the game. And then that's when I was watching them from afar. That's when I approached them and started talking to them about the experience. And in that moment, the game itself, it sort of reached its goal, which was to make people reflect upon the idea of concepts that we always form in our mind, even when we don't have full information or a complete perception of what's going on. It was, in a way, it was kind of like a punch to the gut to make people feel bad, or not bad, but it was more about catharsis, just making you feel something when playing. Yeah. And, I mean, we had like crappy Atari-like graphics for the game. We had a loose narrative. And nevertheless, it was able to make players, discuss the context of the game and even bring that to real life as well. It was a mechanical game, but it was a mechanical game based on player interaction that was meant to evoke a discussion.
Yeah, cool.
And I mean, it's if I do get the option, of course, I'm gonna go for games that are story driven. And it doesn't mean they need to be AAA or anything. I do enjoy. So right now, for example, I just got recently, I did realize there were a series of PS4 exclusive games that I needed to play to be able to discuss and even analyze the narrative. So I'm like, yeah, I think it's about time I play God of War and Uncharted 4 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Red Dead Redemption 2. I'm a big fan of Red Dead Redemption 1. I even played Red Dead Revolver, but I mean, Red Dead Redemption is really what got me hooked into the series. I do enjoy the Grand Theft Autos. I do enjoy it's. I mean, different games have different ways of expressing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Their stories and their messages. As an example, so this is also a very interesting example. When I wrote my thesis for my master's in interactive narrative and how games told their stories. In fact, the name of my thesis is Playing Stories. So it's really much about understanding how games tell their stories. And this also reflects the discussion that we had about theory and practice. I wanted to write a thesis that, of course, discussed the concept of design, because to be able to discuss narrative design, I first needed to define what design was, and based, of course, on a series of different references and different thinkers and academics, etc. But it was about what is design, what are games, what is narrative, and then what is narrative design and what is game design. But what I also wanted to do was not only reflect upon the matter of games and narrative design, but also hear what players wanted to say. So this was in 2014. That was when I concluded my thesis. And I did in late 2013 a questionnaire with about 300 players. And I asked them a series of questions about narrative in games, if they thought it was important, if not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I also did at the end, so this was the only question in which you could write anything. All of the other ones were multiple choice questions. And this one, I asked, what game do you think stood out because of its narrative? And then people could write whatever they wanted. So I collected 300 answers, and then I analyzed them, cross-referenced them, and I got down to this specific top 5. Do you guys want to take a think specifically 2014, 2013, 14? Do you guys want to take a guess at which 5 games these were?
Oh man, 2013, 2014. Man, I feel like that's something that, I'm trying to remember what came out that year that would have been, that's after Skyrim because it's 2011.
BioShock Infinite.
BioShock Infinite. Well, no, that was 2013, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But you guys did say one of the games that was part of the top 5, Skyrim. So Skyrim was one of them. And then we had, you want to guess, Rob? Anything else?
I would have to say, because I'm staring at my wall of games over here. I would have to say Last of Us because that's resonates in my head.
Nice one. Okay, nice one. So The Last of Us, you are correct.
That's not the same year as Uncharted either. No, because they spread theirs out more than that. Gosh. Skyrim, Last of Us.
Lord.
I'm trying to think what else came out that year that would have really.
I mean, it's not that people only voted on games that came out that year, but of course, a lot of people immediately. So another example, an interesting example, was that one of the top 5 games was also Chrono Trigger.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then you think, wait, Chrono Trigger, 1995? But the thing is, at the time, it also came out, I think, around 2013, the DS remake.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, so we have Chrono Trigger, Skyrim, The Last of Us, and then 2 other games. And then we've got, so this might be hard for you guys to guess, but we've got Heavy Rain.
Okay.
Yeah.
And aside from Heavy Rain, we've got Mass Effect. And people talking about actually what's interesting, the first Mass Effect. So that's something, it was interesting because a lot of people voted on, did 2 come out by that? I can't remember, honestly. But I do remember the first Mass Effect.
2 was out by then.
Okay, 2 was out by then. But yeah, the first Mass Effect got a lot of votes, and it was a part of the top 5. So these were actually the top 5 games that, I mean, of course, you had votes for Journey and other amazing games. But the thing is, I mean, we're talking statistically. And what's really cool is that if we look at these 5 games, you've got Heavy Rain, which, I mean, thank God we're past this point where we're always discussing, is it an interactive movie or is it a game? Is it okay, we're past that. Yay! It's just, it might be interactive. It's just a fun experience. It has a story to tell. It has characters. It's awesome. Yeah. I mean, and depending on the situation, you're going to have to put in a CD, a DVD or whatever, a Blu-ray, or depending on the situation, you're just going to be able to hit double click and it's going to run. Regardless, it is an interactive experience if you're going to call it a game, or, I mean, that's just more of a commercial discussion rather than an existential discussion particularly pertinent to the medium, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But then we've got Heavy Rain, which is very different if you think about it from The Last of Us, because The Last of Us is a very linear action adventure oriented. I mean, The Last of Us is almost like Uncharted, but then you have, rather than this action adventure story, you have this post-apocalyptic, very, 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 very somber and sober approach to this relationship between this guy who lost his daughter and is helping this girl, and in a way he sees her as a daughter, and their relationship evolves. And it's I mean, I love The Last of Us. I find it to be amazing. But think about it, game design wise, it's very linear, you know?
It is, and not only that, but you do have the structured narrative, but certainly I think the violence and the gameplay that kind of forces this other narrative onto you is really fascinating to me too.
It is.
Because it's that narrative of, we talked about violence for violence sake earlier, but it's that idea that for some reason the violence in that feels so much more, real's not the word I'm looking for,
visceral.
But it's visceral perhaps. Yeah. And you feel much more connected to it because there is something about the destruction and the death in that game that speaks differently, I think, from a gameplay perspective than something where you could run around through Far Cry and knock out, 700 cultists and not think about it, not bat an eye.
It's really interesting to see that sometimes a death animation in The Last of Us, it's not as gruesome as in other games, but it does make you feel more uncomfortable. It does.
Yes.
It feels more gruesome, even if it aesthetically isn't as gruesome, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's that's what I find fascinating, the way in which they brought this gravitas to the experience of the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, if it's Heavy Rain, The Last of Us, and then you take a look at like a classic JRPG from the 90s, Chrono Trigger, and then you take a look at Mass Effect, which is like this sci-fi RPG full of decisions that even factor into the second game if you take your save. And then you take a look at Skyrim, completely sandbox open world RPG, which is not the case of Mass Effect. So what I found really interesting about all of these games is the fact that you have different ways of telling stories. You know, all of them are games that players considered to be narrative highlights, but all of them as well found different ways to tell their stories, you know? And if you take a look at all of these 5 games, unfortunately, none of them are like hidden indie gems, but you still have amazing indie games that find different ways of telling their stories as well, you know? And it's just, it's fantastic how diversity plays into this fact. So why am I saying all of this? It's just that I'm really into story-driven games and I play pretty much everything. I mean, of course, I do enjoy having fun and playing God of War. Of course, I enjoy the combat. It's really cool. But if it's just the combat for the sake of combat, the violence for the sake of violence, or the puzzle solving for the sake of puzzle solving, the experience is going to feel really stale for me very quickly.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's really important point to drive home too, because we're at a point in gaming where it's getting around, or it's been around long enough where we are gameplay mechanics have not changed or have not evolved significantly. You still have your genres, you still have particular styles of games, and so you can have so many of a shooter, you can have so many of a open world exploration game, you can have so many of a even a side-scrolling game, but it's that narrative or the way that you utilize some of those gameplay mechanics that help unfold that story, that give it a unique feeling, or that will separate it from something else. And I think that's where guys like yourself, who are in an indie or labeled as an indie development studio, have an opportunity to play with those mechanics more so than you do in a AAA space, where there's a bottom line to be met still for most of the time, and there's less risk that's always taken, I think, in that regard as well. So, Arthur, to just kind of wrap things up, do you want to kind of tell us a little bit about where we can find you and how people can contact you and interact with you? You know, any kind of websites or anything that you'd like to kind of throw out there for our audience as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, thank you so much for asking, because it's like we talked a lot about community, so it's always great to be in touch with who's listening and people who are interested and want to learn more about any of the topics we've discussed. Finding me is pretty easy. So I don't remember when was the last time I started using like a moniker or I use a moniker or like an internet nickname. I mean, nowadays I just use my real name. So if you look up Arthur Platazio, it's going to be pretty easy to find me. Of course, if you want to learn more about the work that I do through my company, through my studio with narrative design, then that's super easy. Just go to FablewareDesign.com. That's the website for Fableware. But of course, you can also find the Fableware profiles on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you want to reach out directly to me, and if you reach out to Fableware, you're going to be reaching out directly to me regardless. I'm going to be with the ones answering the emails. But if you want to reach out directly to me, it's super easy to find me on Facebook. Shoot me an email, send me a message. What else? And of course on Steam as well. If you happen to play Sword Legacy, and finding Sword Legacy is super easy as well. The game is currently available for PC. We're definitely looking into porting into other platforms. So I dream of seeing Sword Legacy available on Switch and on mobile platforms as well. I mean, tablets and smartphones. Finding Sword Legacy is super easy. It's available on GOG. It's available on Steam, other stores as well. And if you do have a specific question that you'd like to shoot at in the forums, I can answer as well. If you do play Sword Legacy, please leave us a review. These are you cannot imagine how important they are to us. And it's always a joy to see, to receive feedback on the work that we spent so much time working on. It's our labor of a lot of energy, sweat, love, blood, tears, and all that to combine together. So yeah, I think it's pretty easy to find me, and I'm definitely always open for conversations. Every now and then I do get emails which range drastically from illustrators reaching out to Fableware to writers, to people wondering how to get into game development, or people who just want to talk about story-driven games.
Awesome. I will say I do think Sword Legacy would be a perfect fit on, and this is the bias in me, on PlayStation as well. But
really, I mean that. No, seriously, I'm really, really, really interested in. I mean, that's super interesting to hear, because even when I play on PC, so for example, I played Massive Chalice totally on the controller, and it was a very fun experience. But I have to admit, I'm not as knowledgeable when it comes to. Of course, Final Fantasy Tactics was available on the Super Nintendo, but I mean, I had no idea. Yeah, it's very good to hear that you think that Sword Legacy would be a nice fit for the PlayStation. Good to hear.
I say that because I think that even just from watching some of the developers that I've spoken with, I do see that Switch and PlayStation seem to be their big. They tend to find an audience there, and I think it's because. That audience is big enough, and I think because of you got stuff like, even though it's dead and I still play it daily, even though they don't make anything for it anymore. PlayStation Vita, and I think that crowd naturally has PlayStation as well, and I think that they thrive on playing indie games. And Matt and I know from doing our drop every week when we do this podcast that, and our audience knows too, that we discover games every week that. Through that drop and through that PlayStation, that brief advertisement, that I go, you know what, that looks like a great small game for me to spend a weekend with. And I think Switch, that's actually the only reason I don't own a Switch at this point, is because so much of that is already available on PlayStation that I would just be buying that game double. For me, that's not a necessity at the moment. But I think those are both viable platforms for indies right now, more than anything else, because as much as I enjoy Steam, I do think that store gets crowded from time to time.
You're preaching to the choir.
I think the console space is less crowded at the moment, and so if that's something that a developer can do, I think that certainly benefits them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
Your wish is a command. We shall definitely look into taking Sword Legacy to PlayStation, sir.
Well, I'll make it nice and loud on my Twitter. Believe me, I'll tweet Sony every day if I'd have to, because it's just there are certain games, and I think playing XCOM on my PlayStation, and I know that I've seen some comparisons with Sword Legacy in terms of its combat system too, just like a medieval version of XCOM in terms of its strategy, and so I think it would be a good fit there. But that would be my 2 cents as a biased Sony.
No, I mean it's seriously. I mean, of course, we want to take the game to as many platforms as possible. So it's just, I obviously have nothing against taking it to PlayStation or even Xbox One. It's just that I never really thought that there would be this particular interest. You mentioned a very interesting aspect, which is like the Vita legacy. Like the players who derived from the Vita and are looking for games in a similar genre, but also on the PlayStation.
Yeah. For sure.
Awesome. And then you mentioned Twitter. Just a real quick observation, which is I'm still working on my Twitter skills, but I have to admit I'm not a very agile Twitter user. So if someone wants us to reach out to me, you can believe I am a sort of a classic is sort of a euphemism here, but if you do send me an email, there is a good chance I might be able to respond quicker than via Instagram or Twitter.
Amen to that. Yeah. Rob is definitely the one that deals with the Twitter.
Yeah, I'm the social media guy.
I don't even think I have an account for Twitter.
Dealing with Twitter requires mad, Red Bull skills, man. When you run on like energy drinks the whole day, what do you do?
Oh, believe me, it's definitely an acquired skill set, and I'm not even to the level that I've seen some people be on Twitter, and so I'm small time compared to that. But well, Arthur, again, thanks for coming by. You guys can check him out on those different platforms. Certainly go check out Sword Legacy. It's a great game, beautiful style, great narrative. Please feel free to drop him a line, give him some feedback. He'll love it. So thanks again, Arthur, for joining us. Matt, thanks for joining us as well. I know I appreciate you being here every week. I never thank you, though.
Oh, my pleasure, Rob.
Well, I'm going to jump into this chain of gratefulness and say thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Matt. It was awesome talking to you two. Thank you so much for having me over. You guys get the gist. It's always a pleasure to be able to not only talk about the project, but also talk about these more personal stories of developing games.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, until next time, game on.
Game on.
Game on!
This is the outro music, the regal outro music. It's about Uther and his friends, and they're gonna kill you in the end.
Oh, I like that.